Welcome to the bonus show. We are, as of this moment, still awaiting the verdict as the jury deliberates in Donald Trump's first of some number still to be determined criminal trials. I no longer say the first of four, Pat, because honestly, I don't know that the other three are necessarily going to make it to trial.
Yeah, that's totally fair. We may only have this one before the election. We may have one more.
Yeah.
Hopefully, he'll eventually face trial, but we can't guarantee that.
So I've previously told you that we have polling that says only 20% of the country would vote for a convicted Donald Trump. And I am very skeptical of that poll because I think a lot of the people that say they won't vote for Trump if he's convicted will, if they can convince themselves that the verdict is unfair or that the entire thing is a witch hunt. We now have new polling from NPR, PBS NewsHour, Marist, which finds that the verdict one way or the other won't have much of an impact. So the results of the poll are 2/3 say a guilty verdict would make no difference to their vote. 3/4 say a not guilty verdict would make no difference to their vote. So it's logical that not guilty has less of an impact than guilty, right? Because not guilty just means he's still a candidate who hasn't been convicted of a crime. It doesn't change anything, although you could argue, well, an acquittal is a positive action. But in some sense, it makes sense to me, Pat, that the guilty verdict would have more of an impact, even though most voters are saying it won't have a huge impact. However, my reading of this is different. If 67% say a guilty verdict will make no difference, that means 33% say it will. And that's more than enough to swing this election based on how close it's supposed to be. Like, isn't that the obvious interpretation here?
It absolutely could change the course of the election. We also have to consider how folks like you and I aren't going to have our opinions swayed by the outcome of this trial. Whether Trump is found guilty or not guilty, we're still not going to vote for him. So there are plenty of people who've already made up their minds when it comes to Trump, and I don't think they're going to be changing it anytime soon, certainly not based on the outcome of this trial. So, we'll have to see what actually happens because we can predict, people be willing to vote for a convicted felon. And in the abstract, they may say no. But then when it actually takes place, because it gets slow rolled and because the right will have some counter narrative about what's taking place, they could easily change their minds. But even if you take a look at like the independent slice of the electorate, if 1 out of 5 change their minds because Trump is now a convicted felon, that could easily be enough to swing the vote. So it may be depressing at first sight looking at these poll numbers. But because we know that elections are decided on basically by about 100,000 people across a few states, that could actually absolutely make the difference.
If you look at the kind of breakdown, there are 10% of Republicans who say if he's guilty, I won't vote for him. That's crazy. That's 1 out of 10 Republicans. So in terms of the consequence, that would be huge. 11% of rural people who live in rural areas say if he's guilty, I won't vote for him. That potentially could be what makes some swing state go for Biden rather than Trump. So the headlines are most people won't change their vote. The I believe more accurate interpretation is enough people say they would change their vote that it actually could be what the election hinges on at the end of the day.
Yep. And to go back to what you said before, I can't imagine that there are too many people who have decided, okay, I'm not going to vote for Trump. But then if they hear that there's an acquittal, they'll change their mind and say, okay, yeah, I'm going to vote for him because it turns out that my understanding of this Stormy Daniels hush money case wasn't correct. So because he was acquitted of this, that means that maybe other opinions I have about Trump aren't true. There are going to be some people, I'm sure, that take that approach. But for the most part, people have their minds made up. And I think you can only really do damage with a guilty verdict for the most part. There could be some folks in the middle who don't know about the outcome. Maybe he did do the hush money payment. Maybe he didn't. Maybe it was election interference. Maybe it wasn't. And only once they see that guilty verdict and perhaps a harsh sentence will they decide to change their mind and say, you know what, this is too far. I can't vote for a convicted felon. We've got to go with Biden or someone else.
So the sentencing part that you just alluded to is another big part of this because all the polling is about guilty or innocent, or guilty or not guilty, rather. Sorry. But there's a question both about the impact and the timing of sentencing. Imagine that we get a guilty verdict and sentencing is, first of all, I'm guessing his lawyers will argue for sentencing after the election. I hope that the judge will say, absolutely not. It's not even June. Do you know anything about the timing of sentencing?
My understanding is that in the state of New York, sentencing happens pretty soon after
Okay.
the verdict, within like a week or so.
Okay.
Now, it may take longer in this case because you have to get the Secret Service coordinated with the prison bureau in the state of
Right.
New York, because there's the potential that you could send a
Can you
former
imagine?
president to prison. So, it may take a couple of weeks or so, but
Yep.
it is pretty speedy in New York.
So, assuming that there's no justification for delaying sentencing, what impact would sentencing have? Because you could have people now saying, well, if he's guilty, here's how it affects my vote. But then you could have, well, I'm sentenced. And by the way, guilty of a misdemeanor or guilty of a felony? That's another question here. I think
Mhm.
there are people who believe they will be impacted, but if it's a misdemeanor, they will say, this is really nothing. It was merely political. What about I have a different feeling about, oh, he gets a suspended 90-day sentence versus he's going to have to sit in jail for some period of time. And of course, what that maximum amount of time would be depending on the convictions. The sentencing may also impact people's feeling about whether or not to vote for him in November.
I think that makes sense because if Trump is found guilty, but he just has to pay a fine or just gets probation or just gets house arrest, he'll effectively have gotten away with it and
Yeah.
we won't hear about this case further. But let's say he does get a 1 year jail sentence. There could be a lot of people who, just from a practical standpoint, think, okay, well, we can't have a president
Right.
serving from prison. That would be
Exactly.
absolutely crazy. So even though I don't know the specifics about this case or believe that he did it or didn't do it, the fact of the matter is he's going to jail, and we can't have a president serve from jail. That would just be a logistical nightmare. That would be an embarrassment for the country. So I can't vote for him for that reason. So that
Not to
will also
mention,
play an
now I also
effect.
want to throw out something else. The jail sentence may be short enough that it would be served and over with if Trump wants to expedite it before he would be inaugurated. I mean, there's so many unknowns right now that it's just very difficult to say. But the one thing I would add is the surveys and the polls about the effect of conviction or acquittal are very interesting. But then I wonder, in the case of a conviction, what about the effect of the sentencing? And all we can do for now is wait. A top ranking Republican on a Senate committee, Roger Wicker, wants more money for defense spending. He wants $55 billion in defense spending over the limits that are currently set in order to deal with what he says are our increasingly aggressive adversaries, Russia, Iran, and China. He acknowledges it's going to be tough to get even more money to get beyond the spending caps that are already there, which, by the way, are really, really high, and we spend an insane amount of money on defense. He says we just have no choice. Quote, we would be very foolish on a national survival basis to adhere to that. He means these artificially self-imposed caps when it comes to national defense. He says basically we just need more money, more money, endlessly more money for defense spending. He says that we're in a new Cold War. He says as a percentage of GDP, we actually need to do way more, that as a percentage of GDP, defense spending has been coming down. We have a much larger GDP now than we did during the Cold War. We can afford to spend way more, et cetera. You know, my initial instinct on something like this, Pat, is there is zero appetite for this, and this is crazy. But then I think about it a little more, and I'm kind of not so sure, because I think that the ambiguity and uncertainty with regard to Russia, Iran, and China does make even some moderates maybe say, hey, listen, are we going to put the nation at risk over like half a percentage point of GDP when we could just spend an extra half percentage point? That would be really crazy. And I think you can talk a lot of people into this, as crazy as it sounds.
Yeah, I don't know. I think most of the country is still pretty war weary because we just ended a 20-year war in the Middle East. Of course, the Afghanistan war, which Biden pulled out of, and it wasn't soon before that. It wasn't long before that when we ended the Iraq war. I just get the sense that the American public at this point is tired of war, tired of spending so much money on defense. Now, that can change,
Yeah.
certainly, as time goes on. Maybe people will forget more and more about the disastrous war on terror and they'll find a new enemy to want to target. Certainly we were war weary as a country after Vietnam, and Americans didn't really get back into that war spirit until 9/11. So it could take a tragic event like that to reverse the trend. But from what I'm seeing, I don't think too many Americans at this point would go along with a proposal like this. Ultimately, it may not matter, though, because we know the power of the military industrial complex. We
Yeah.
know the control they have over so many of our legislators. And so I think that they'll be able to increase defense spending this year as they do just about every year.
Yeah. I don't know that this happens if Democrats successfully defend the Senate and certainly take the House, importantly, where the purse strings are kept in November. But I think it's certainly the sort of thing where, they don't really have policy, and just shoveling more money at defense can be an interesting proxy for policy for a Republican controlled White House, House, Senate, et cetera. So it actually seems to me like the sort of thing that would happen if Republicans take over as a replacement for actually doing anything policy wise.
Yeah, and Democrats are often willing to go along too with just raising defense spending. It's typically not something that we even critically think about, but we've talked all the time about how if you just take the increase that we did on defense spending for this 1 year, you could, do a lot in the way of solving homelessness or some of these other issues
Sure.
that, wouldn't really cost that much money. Free college tuition, state college tuition is another one that comes to mind. But it's just kind of given in our politics that we're constantly willing to spend more and more on defense. And this argument from Wicker about how we have to be worried about China, we have to be worried about Russia, we have to be worried about Iran. There's always some enemy that we can point to, right? I mean, it was the Soviet Union at one point, and then it was terrorists in the Middle East.
Yep.
Now it's these other countries. I think that we're always going to be able to find some sort of boogeyman out there in the world.
And one of the reasons why it can be effective as a political technique is even to people who are skeptical of more defense spending, getting them on, listen, what if the extra 55 billion is what prevents X or Y? And that sort of thing can actually work to convince people.
Yeah, and they can point out how that money is actually being spent in the United States because it's going to defense contractors, and that's going to build up the economy in different parts of the country so they can manufacture the weapons. They'll definitely make that argument as well. They may even say that it's economically stimulative because war can be economically stimulative, but we have to keep a level head here. I understand that members of Congress are going to have their own interests, and the military and contractors are going to have their own interests, but we have to fight back against it to the extent that we can, because to just continue ballooning the amount of money that we're spending on defense year after year, I don't think it's good for the country, and I don't think it's good for our position in the world.
If I asked you, are we ready for the next pandemic? I'm guessing most people in our audience would say absolutely not. Now, domestically, we know about the dismantling of the pandemic response team under Donald Trump. We know about the flushing down the toilet, metaphorically, of the pandemic response playbook that was left behind by the Obama administration. But what about globally? Well, we have a situation right now where health officials are meeting in Switzerland, trying to wrap up 2 years of negotiations on some kind of global pandemic treaty and an update to international health rules, as they are called. Countries have failed to finalize the treaty, and there is an extension being considered in terms of the timeline for actually getting this done. Reportedly, 80% of what's in there is agreed to. What's becoming a sticking point is what's the agreement around the sharing of drugs and vaccines? What about the hoarding that arguably took place, sort of like by everyone in the global north, we would say, plus Australia, right? I mean, it's like Africa and Latin America that got vaccines, generically speaking, later or fewer in terms of doses available. So, this is one of those things where we obviously need this. We're obviously not prepared for the next pandemic. In the United States, in the context of bird flu that we've been discussing, I think there's such pandemic fatigue that I think there would be huge hesitation from people to even say, hey, okay, we got to do something now, and this, it's happening. We obviously need this, Pat, and I really struggle to believe that we are going to put something together that under a Trump administration, we would even be willing to stick to.
That's the thing, right? You can sign the paperwork, but will countries be willing to stick to the framework in the agreement? Will they commit to the spending? Will they commit to the different measures? And when we actually do face our next pandemic, inevitably, will all of this work be proven fruitful? Will it even make sense? Will we actually have prepared in the right way? Because with the nature of disease, you don't always know which disease is going to take over, what the symptoms are going to be, how it spreads, and all these different things, whether a vaccine would be some
With
sort
Schwab
of
investing,
something useful that we can throw at it, whether other normal medications are the way forward. So we don't know when it comes to these things. We
Yeah.
can try to come up with the framework, but even if we do get everyone on board, I'm just not totally sure that it would even do all that much good. But certainly getting it signed is the first step.
I agree with you. I do think that this has more value if someone like Joe Biden is president at the time that it needs to be enacted versus someone like Trump, because we saw what happened with the Iran nuclear deal. He just didn't like it. So he said, we're out of it, even though Iran hadn't violated it. This is less about violation. This is about cooperation in a way that maybe the Iran nuclear deal is not. But this is, I mean, after what took place, now that we get more distance from it, I'm very willing to concede that some of the things that were done early didn't really make sense in retrospect, which Sam Harris has also talked about and said, listen, we had limited information. If we believe this is what we can do to improve the situation, it would be irresponsible not to do it. Okay, now we have more information. We were working in an emergency situation. I'm willing to concede the bleaching of vegetables that some people were doing or some of these things. Okay, not everything made sense. And also, if next time everyone takes the approach of screw every health service, no one knew or knows anything, I'm going to do whatever the hell I want. If there's a higher death rate of whatever the next pandemic is, a more deadly pathogen, we're screwed.
Yeah, it's incredibly annoying hearing from those people who denied COVID was a serious thing all along, now claiming that they were vindicated, that they were right about this or that. But really, it's because people who actually did take COVID seriously did the right mitigation measures, and we were able to control the spread to some degree. And then we developed vaccines, and ultimately it really was the mass vaccination program that led to the end of this pandemic. But the average person out there who was a denier of COVID and didn't want to take the vaccine, it's not like their actions led to the end of this thing. It was actually in spite of their actions that we were able to get through it. And they'll say, oh, well, I didn't know anyone who died of COVID. In fact, I know someone who took the vaccine and now they're facing some sort of complications from it. They're essentially making stuff up. And if we went with their blueprint from the very beginning of this thing, it would have spread uncontrollably. We would have had so many more millions of people dead. We can't ever verify these things for sure because we only live in our one reality and the one course of events that take place. But of course, just knowing how the disease was able to spread, knowing how deadly it was, certainly at the beginning, suggests that these people were completely wrong. And so for them to act like they were right about this whole thing, it's frustrating to no end.
It's frustrating to no end, exactly. And I still get calls about like, David, are you ready to admit X? And it's like, no, what you're saying makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. We've seen it with the continued efforts to push hydroxychloroquine, or I guess more recently it's been ivermectin. We've seen it with all of it. So listen, great idea. Global unified effort around pandemic response makes absolutely perfect sense in every way. Who's going to stick to it when the rubber meets the road? That's sort of the real question. We are on verdict watch with the Trump trial. We will be back tomorrow with the Friday show.